Okay, we'll wait another moment to let people trickle in, and then we'll begin. All right. Welcome everyone to Scrubbing the Skies, the seminar series of the Institute for Responsible Carbon Removal at American University. As always, I'm your host, Will Burns, and I serve as co-director of the Institute. And I'm glad that you're all joining us here in the early stages of summer. As many of you probably know, the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution is currently seeking a permit from the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency to conduct what would be the largest scale ocean iron fertilization field experiment to date. In many ways, that's the good news. The bad news is that uh, it's questionable whether this gets us very far, right? Even if this experiment is conducted, we still don't have the critical institutional governance framework in place to be able to substantially expand this kind of research. We don't have the kind of confidence from potential investors or communities that could ultimately scale ocean iron fertilization to requisite levels if we determine that this is acceptable. And so it raises a question: how do we establish that kind of robust framework to facilitate simultaneously effective governance as well as large-scale research that provides the kind of signals that could facilitate the build out of ocean iron fertilization in the long term if it's deemed to be judicious. And we have a guest today who has developed a potential framework to facilitate this, and so I thought it would be great to have him on. Let me introduce Anton Elfernus, who is with Paradigm Climate LLC, and he will provide a presentation today that provides an overview of what he calls the MCDR Governance Framework Pilot Program for the Gulf of Alaska. As always, we will begin with an initial intervention from Anton of approximately 20 minutes. I will follow that up with a couple of seating questions, and then we will move to audience questions. And so, as always, please feel free to begin to propagate the Q&A box with any questions you have. That will help me determine how much time to allocate at the end in terms of audience questions. And so with that, I will turn over the microphone to Anton. Welcome.
Great. Thank you, Will. I really appreciate you having me on, and I appreciate the opportunity to talk about this. I'm going to share my screen and present. Is that coming through? All right. A little bit about me, just for context. I'm a former mechanical systems engineer. I've worked in startups most of my career. I am an entrepreneur working on some MCDR technologies. I have been a student of marine and climate science for 18 years and 5 months, not that anybody's counting. And I'm committed to working on climate restoration in a responsible way. And I sit deliberately somewhere in between academia and Silicon Valley. And I'll kind of explain what that means in a bit. Foundational to this talk, there's a couple puzzle pieces I just want to throw on the table. Climate change is accelerating. We don't have time to do everything sequentially, and decarbonization alone is not going to get us out of this problem. We cannot solve climate change at the pace of academia. It is too slow, sorry. We cannot solve climate change without the world ocean, and we cannot develop and scale MCDR in the style of Silicon Valley, where you go fast and break things, Other industries have also not adopted Silicon Valley's go fast and break things. The medical device industry doesn't do it, pharma doesn't do it, agriculture doesn't do it, aerospace doesn't do it. So it really is only is a software thing. And some people think they can come to MCDR with that mindset, and it's just not going to work. Big part of the reason for that is among the risks, particularly with ocean iron fertilization, or ocean fertilization as I prefer to call it, um, there are ecological risks. There's harmful algal blooms, deoxygenation, greenhouse gas production through the decomposition process, etc. But the largest ecological risk, in my view, with ocean fertilization is capitalism. And I don't mean capitalism just like in any form. I mean unconstrained, ungoverned capitalism. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. Today, I'm going to talk a little bit, there's kind of two sections to this. First is what I call the mess of ocean fertilization. It's sort of a semi-status report and some of Anton's opinions. And then the second part is an overview of the MCDR governance framework pilot program for the Gulf of Alaska region. This is Brad Warren's idea, this in his framework. I have contributed to it. But Brad Warren of Global Ocean Health is the originator of it. Amongst the couple of contributions I've made to it is a new potential funding mechanism called the research credit, and we'll get into that. And then somewhere along the way, I'm going to do a shameless self-promotion on a new modeling effort that is underway. First, we have to talk about the elephant in the room. Ocean fertilization is controversial. It is wildly exaggerated. It is misunderstood. It is poorly modeled. It is ecologically risky if performed incorrectly, and it is a potential MCDR and ocean health restoration technique. I shouldn't say everything. Many things in our daily lives are risky if performed incorrectly. How you drive your car, you can drive it with your eyes closed and probably get into an accident and hurt people. How I personally run with scissors, all 10 of them, can be very risky. It just depends on how you perform whatever it is you're performing. So this notion that ocean fertilization is somehow a binary thing is false. The how you do it is more important than whether you do it. It determines, in fact, whether you should do it. So just real quick on the mess of ocean fertilization, there's been 13 field trials from 1993 to 2009. There was a 2012 commercial event that became very controversial. And since then, all ocean fertilization research has essentially been blocked or stopped because of that controversy. Most funders still avoid funding it for a mix of reasons. And there's many layers to the regulatory onion: state, provincial, federal, international, tribal, indigenous, First Nations. There's all kinds of regulatory layers to it. Makes it difficult. The reality is Mother Nature does ocean fertilization every single day. In fact, every single minute of every single day. 30% of the world ocean is iron limited. Nutrient loads in different regions vary. If Amazon only delivered 70% of your packages, you would very quickly cease to order from them. It would be considered wildly inefficient. But with the ocean, we just assume like, oh, it's at maximal efficiency. No, it's really not. It's got some very inefficient nutrient delivery and distribution attributes. Net primary productivity, which is phytoplankton, has been in decline roughly about 15% globally. Some places have increases, many places have decreases, and that has been occurring over the past about 3 decades. And this will get worse as climate change gets worse. Ocean fertilization could be a useful technique if we can find an ecologically safe way of doing it. And it can only be scaled through governance, through a governance co-design process regionally due to the heterogeneity of the world ocean. I talk to a lot of people about ocean fertilization, and I'm finding that there's a spectrum of people and their views on it. And I want to talk about the 3 types that I tend to gravitate to. There is this silver bullet crowd, people who think ocean fertilization is a silver bullet. It's going to solve climate change. It's going to cure cancer. It's going to do all these great things. And they unfortunately use wild numbers like, oh, it's going to pull down 20 gigatons a year. This is not true. There's no scientific underpinning for that kind of wild speculation. On the other side of the spectrum is what I call the catastrophe crowd. Now, there's some NGOs that are against it and people that are afraid of geoengineering, even though humans geoengineer every single day. But this catastrophe crowd is much more interesting because it has a lot of scientists in it. And I think I have a little bit of an understanding of why some of these folks are so against it. And we'll unpack that in I think the next slide. But I try to sit somewhere in the first principles middle, maybe a little bit closer to the blue, really trying to look at how can we do it safely. So one of the reasons I think some of the scientists believe it is super dangerous is because there have been some very bad modeling studies around this. Large Earth system models that most scientists use, they're not built for project level, project-based ocean fertilization analysis or any other MCDR analysis on a very granular level. And you can put bad scenario inputs into it and get out unrealistic outcomes. I want to pick on one particular model study. I won't name the authors, and I'll try to be nice about this, but there's a study out there that has really influenced a lot of scientists into believing ocean fertilization is dangerous and problematic. And it basically, because of the lack of granularity, they basically built the model input to be that they would fertilize everywhere below the 38th parallel every second of every day for 100 years and to look at what the possible outcomes would be. And that is 90 million square kilometers. So we're talking everywhere, all the time, 24/7 as a model input. And that does not have anywhere near a realistic, plausible, logistical, economic, feasible chance of being achieved. That just doesn't make any sense. So if we're not going to model realistic, probable fertilization methods and outcomes, what are we doing? And do we have an agenda there? And I can sit here and be a critic and point to that and other model studies and criticize them. But unless I'm willing to do something about it, I should probably be quiet about it. So fortunately, this is my shameless self-promotion here. We are currently building a hypergranular regional ocean fertilization process model that will be done, that will be launched version 1 likely in about 6 to 8 weeks. We've been working on that for about 3 months. All right, for part 2, I want to talk about the MCDR Governance Framework Pilot Program. This is a proposal we are developing for the Gulf of Alaska region. Foundational to this governance aspect of the talk is this has to be done as a bottom-up, stakeholder-driven, co-design, co-development process. It is modeled after successful marine protected area development. MPAs, when they fail, it's usually because they've been top down and not bottom up, meaning they didn't consult the users of the ocean space in that region. They didn't consult with the indigenous communities. They didn't consult with the fisheries community. So they usually fail because people don't like being told what to do, even if they agree with it. The governance purpose is to constrain ultimately commercial operations to ethical and ecologically safe behavior. And to note here, the London Convention, London Protocol, which is an international regulatory regime, does not allow for ocean fertilization to be performed for financial gain. Because of much of what Will said at the outset of this, there's a real lack of funding currently for ocean fertilization research. The governance process will convene stakeholder representatives in a learning network. That'll be the first thing that happens. And fortunately, that has been just completed. Correct me if I'm wrong on that, Will. That was a 5-month process performed by Will Burns and Brad Warren through Global Ocean Health. Next, we'll need to fund the pilot program. And then the stakeholders, from a process standpoint, will deliberate on ecological change thresholds, control rules, mitigation requirements, and other aspects to a good governance system. This would be in staggered parallel with the scientific team's 4-year field trial process. And both in parallel actually provide some benefit to both the governance development and the field trial science team, because it provides context and it provides forcing functions for each other. So the stakeholders in this we've identified as the scientific community, the indigenous coastal communities, the fisheries management folks, the nonprofits, the regulators, uh, non-indigenous coastal communities, carbon credit buyers, and carbon credit sellers. That's an 8 stakeholder group, and there's one group in there that should probably never be able to vote. I think that'll be built into the rule system, and that is the carbon credit sellers. Again, the whole point of this governance is really to constrain that one stakeholder group to good behavior and good ecological practices. In a 4-year process, it looks a little bit like this. The red is years 1 through 4. There would be in parallel, there'd be scientific field trials with engineering field trials. Ocean fertilization has quite a few engineering challenges. So we anticipate both science and engineering field trial work happening in those 4 years. In parallel, the governance setup, the governance development will be going on. And this is the part where I think we can add a funding mechanism. So after the second year, there should be a review gate to determine if years 3 and 4 should continue. Years 1 and 2 field trials, the size and duration of a bloom will be initially small to medium, and it will get bigger in years 3 and 4, producing much more carbon sequestration potentially. And the scientific teams and engineering teams will refine their operations to become more accurate in the readings of how much carbon sequestration makes it down to depth. So if approved at the review gate at the end of year 2, years 3 and 4, our proposal is that there's a business validation trial for each of those 2 years where research credits can be sold, hopefully to carbon credit buyers who will be sitting on the stakeholder group called the carbon credit buyers. I'm going to explain this, and I apologize for the slightly wackadoodle image that may be difficult to see on the right-hand side. So I'll walk you through it. Imagine the science team raises some philanthropic government money, and which is going to pay for the 4 years of field trials. And they put that into an intermediary entity. This could be University of Anchorage, it could be a nonprofit, it could be Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute. So that money gets put in there to cover the 4 years of field trial. Now, year 1, they have the research entity and does some scientific field trials of a certain size. Year 2, it's of a larger size. There's a review gate. If it is approved, then it goes to years 3 and 4. And in years 3 and 4, the intermediary entity can then sell basically a carbon credit, but called a research credit, that has different rules to it than regular carbon credits. We'll get to that in a second. And that money verified, or that the amount of sequestration as verified by a third-party verifier, can then go back to the intermediary company to get returned to the original funders of the 4-year program. So let's say, hypothetically, that it costs $50 million to do this total program for 4 years. That's the operational cost of it. And let's assume for a second that somehow they were to sell research credits in an amount that might equal, let's say, $35 million. So those funders of this would have gotten, given $50 million to have the research team do the field trials, and they would have gotten all but 15 million back. And now they can use that for other purposes, for other marine CDR research in other locations, or they can use it for whatever else their private foundation or whatever else feels like using it for. It's a way to kick the money back It also there's no touching of the money that doesn't travel through the research team or anyone else involved. It just goes back to the intermediary entity to be returned to the funders. So it should satisfy the London Convention, London Protocol requirement of no financial gain. The research credit will have some special attributes, but it is a form of a carbon credit. The research team will be um, creating a bloom. It will be measuring the carbon export and determining how much of that is carbon sequestration with a 100-year time horizon. And so they're going to be doing that activity anyways, right? So selling a research credit to help pay for the high cost of field trial work to me makes a lot of sense. These credits would be non-fungible, non-tradable, like unlike other credits where you could buy them, hold on to them for a few years and sell them later. It would be limited in time and scope. So it would only be done in the third and fourth year of that 4-year pilot program and can only be sold by an approved intermediary entity. So no research or commercial entity touches the money in any way, shape, or form, and the money passes back to the original funders of the field trial program. After the pilot program, we'll have had a bunch of field trial work to vet out how to do ocean fertilization in an ecologically safe way. We will know if it is economically viable, potentially, and to what degree it can contribute to climate change mitigation. I suspect all three of those are going to be in somewhat degree of tension. We will have a template and a potential funding mechanism that other groups and other regions could use to develop governance and a process to legitimately vet out their region's MCDR potential. And there will be control rules and ecological change thresholds that will be built into protocols and automations and hopefully laws. So in summary, ocean fertilization is a complex mess. It is not a boogeyman, nor is it your savior. It is a natural process that Mother Nature performs every day. The questions that this program needs to answer in the 4 years is, can it be governed by stakeholders and built into regulations? Can it be performed in an ecologically safe manner? Can it be a useful MCDR technique? Can it help reconstitute any part of the primary productivity decline? And can it be performed in an economically viable way? Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Anton, for that presentation. And so, as I said, we will now proceed to some questions to scrutinize this, and I'll start with a couple, and I encourage our audience to start populating the Q&A box, and I'll get to those very soon. So, first question I have is, I think you correctly characterized the London Convention and protocol regime as having a very different orientation than the framework that you propose, including no real mechanism for a comparative risk assessment, though there's some suggestions of maybe getting there. No mechanism for regional co-governance, and pretty limited guidance in terms of developing adaptive management protocols for either ocean iron fertilization or any of the other MCDR approaches that might be regulated. Those are pretty profound differences in the culture of this regime than what you're proposing. Given the fact that I think you contemplate that London would have a role as one of those groups, do you think that the regime would likely buy into this vision?
Yeah, I have a couple responses to that. I think when I first started thinking about this, I found it to be an unreasonable ask to try and get the London Convention, London Protocol folks to change international law to allow some variance or some changes to how they view ocean fertilization. That's just at least in a time frame that is acceptable with the rate of climate change. I think what is a much more reasonable ask is to ask them to send a representative and participate in a pilot program to look at an experiment. And that is a much easier thing to say yes to. So that's the first part of my answer. So I don't know the full answer. I'm friends with Chris Vivian. He's a very well-respected expert on this, and so he is definitely somebody I want to have a long conversation with about this. But the other part of my answer to this and why I inserted stating that the work that we're doing on the modeling front in this, which I hadn't thought about putting that into until yesterday, is because I think what our modeling work is going to show is going to be a very different result than what a lot of these former large Earth system model studies have been able to show. With their lack of granularity, they can only show radically unrealistic model inputs with probably radically unrealistic outcomes. And by getting a hypergranular model to show what it would actually do more realistically within a range, I think is going to change the conversation and some of the discourse. And I'm hoping I can get that in front of some of the LCLP folks. At least I know I can get in front of Chris, and maybe he can give me some feedback on who to talk to. So I think in my view, there's sort of there's a two-prong approach. One is by getting this new type of model built and utilized. And the second would be asking them to, participate in a pilot study.
Okay, fair enough. All right. Another question. In the longer report that you wrote on this that I reviewed in the last couple days, you indicate that in developing this framework, no group that was participating would, quote, have the power to stop or impose decisions, right? But there seems to be a bit of tension here because you emphasize, I think, really correctly, the critical role that indigenous groups would play in the North Pacific in terms of ocean air fertilization, especially given the legacy of the interface in the past of ocean air and fertilization experiments and indigenous peoples. But if you look at the nature of free, prior, and informed consent, especially under the UNDRIP incarnation of this, there seems to be an emphasis on the right of indigenous groups to cast a veto, or at least very strong impetus to stop a project that they don't believe is judicious. So, how would you reconcile those potential rights against your incarnation that says that no one group has a right to exert a veto, but has to reconcile their interests with others?
Yeah, I think there's a couple things in that I will answer that with. Number one, that's still in rough draft form. I mean, I think we're on version 14 because it's really hard to get that language correct.
Mhm.
Um, I think one of the missing pieces in that paper is the governance framework is there to build control rules and there to build the framework under which this could be researched and developed. And those are slightly different things, obviously, research and development. So the intention of it is to build rules around ecological change thresholds that, if violated, create an automatic cessation of any fertilization, and in the case of HABs, creates an automatic protocol for remelioration of that mitigation of that HAB spot. And there's several ways that could be done mechanically through flocculants or other ways to sink that really fast so it doesn't get into keep drifting along and get worse. So what we're trying to say there with that, what I'm trying to say with that is that the framework itself should embody everyone's interest in safe ecological outcomes with automated uh, controls that if there is a problem, it automatically triggers. So nobody has to vote on the trigger result, What they have to vote on early is like what level of mitigation, what level of change thresholds. If the total group decides, and again, the developers can't vote on any of this in my view. Um, in the beginning of this, they will define what those are and then build those protocols into it. Obviously, with research, the size of those blooms are not going to be large enough to cause much of a mess at all. But
Mhm.
when they get to the larger size, they're going to be a little bit trickier. So I'm not saying that if there's a HABs event or oh my gosh, it's pulling out too much oxygen. I'm not saying they have to convene and then vote on what to do. They should be building the automatic, hey, that violated the change threshold amount, and it automatically triggers consequences and mitigation. So I want to be very careful about like we haven't articulated that very well. I haven't articulated that very well, but that will be part of it so that they have the right to say on the front end, hey, we think the change threshold, the ecological change threshold should be very narrow, and they
Mhm.
will have a lot more influence than likely anyone else. Fisheries management and indigenous communities will have an outsized influence on that governance framework, and they should. All of the framework should be designed to constrain two groups. The most important group to constrain is the developers. So they have to operate within ecologically safe parameters. But the leverage from that is really going to be the other groups pushing the carbon credit buyers to adhere to the protocols designed by the and approved by the governance structure. So that if the developer gets out of line, the buyers aren't going to buy their carbon credits, and that's a way to shut that company down because they're not obviously operating with good ethics and good ecological safeguards. So I think it's more about building a system rather than what I think we implied there, which is that we'd all be voting on all these things all the time, and that's not where we want to go. We really want to build a system level. It so it enforces what we want in ecological safeguards. So I think that's maybe a little bit missing in that 26-page document.
Right. It, Let me just ask you one follow-up question with that,
Yeah.
right? Because that incarnation, and it can certainly be justified, but that incarnation is a very sort of technocratic sort of approach, right? We're going to look at critical ecological thresholds. We're going to establish clear metrics for those, and then deviation from that triggers automatic responses. But if your conception of free, prior, and informed consent with an emphasis on indigenous people, right, is to be consistent, it may be that indigenous groups object to a project of this nature not on the basis of strict sort of ecological thresholds, but because they don't believe that one should intervene in nature in this way, right, in a way that's deemed to be unnatural, or
Yeah.
they might invoke the moral hazard, right? And say we believe this is going to ensure that we don't, focus on job one, mitigation, right?
Yeah.
Is there any room for that to come into the equation? And does free, prior, and informed consent mean that at the end of the day they have a right to wield a veto? And if they don't, what's the standard, and how does it deviate from what UNDRIP would tell us was necessary?
Yeah. I think the reality is in the Gulf of Alaska, uh, the Tlingit, the Haida, the First Nations, they have enormous political and social power, and they should.
Mhm.
If they don't want ocean fertilization happening in the Gulf of Alaska, I think they just shut it down. Like I think they have inherent power to get that to say no and get it shut down, regardless of what any other stakeholder desires in the stakeholder governance framework. Um, we would hope that at least getting through the research would be helpful to the scientific understanding of this MCDR technique. We would hope that understanding that primary productivity is very limited in the Gulf of Alaska, and this may contribute, if done correctly, to improved fisheries. So there are beneficial reasons to at least allow the scientific research to go forward. they might say at the end of it, hey, there, we could all get to the end of the 4-year pilot program, and really the ecological impacts were negligible, and we had good fisheries improvement, and they still don't want commercial entities to go do this. That could be a valid outcome that is decided by that community. And so I think, that's reality option number one. In a parallel universe, I think the other side of this is a lot of ocean fertilization um, is going to happen in the pelagic, out in the middle of the ocean. It's not coastal. It's outside the economic exclusion zones. There are countries around the world that are looking at doing it. I think the standard for governance would be the highest in the Gulf of Alaska. And so if it can be, this governance framework can be built and performed while the research is happening, that could be a model that could be used in other locations. And it would be a higher threshold, higher standard model than I think some other locations and some other countries and some other folks that are looking at doing this would have some difficulty rising to, but if they did, it would be more robust.
Yep. All right. Another question I had is your proposal would mandate that any MCDR company that's operating in this delineated region would have to maintain a research and development partnership with scientific institutions in the region. How do you contemplate from a legal perspective this would be enforced, or would this be purely voluntary? And if it was purely voluntary, that then you're contemplating that some might just not play the game.
Yeah, I think I want to unpack the origin of that. Um, the ocean is a very dynamic environment, and with climate change accelerating, it is a changing environment. And with any MCDR technique, we're going to then on top of that, those elements, we're going to add more changes. So we don't know the full spectrum of outcome potential across all of that. So I actually don't see the research component leaving the process of ocean fertilization, even if it gets to be able to be commercially viable. I think it has to continue with an element of continued research, because every time you do a field trial, it's literally a new experiment, because dynamics change, ocean physics change, biogeochemical conditions change, trophic activity changes, temperature changes, currents, surface and subsurface change. I think the reality is, because of all that, there needs to be research as part of a scaling operation.
Mhm.
We coined this phrase research-driven scaling about half a year ago, something like that. And that kind of attempted to embody what we mean by that. Um, Now, 20 years, 30 years from now, if it's ecologically okay to keep doing this, there may be less of a need for that. But I think in the near term, decoupling from science, from research, from good ecological monitoring is just not a program we want to endorse. I think it just is ecologically safer. It's safer for communities if we keep this transparent research and scientific element in the process, even after this 4-year field trial pilot program. And second part of that, how would you enforce that? I don't know on the legal front, but I think it should be built into the protocols, or a protocol for that region for ocean fertilization, as an example, built into the carbon credit protocol that has to be adhered to by the carbon credit buyers and sellers. And therefore, if it deviates from that, the carbon credit buyers shouldn't buy it. So I think, again, leveraging them to be the ethical element in the room that takes all their interests and all their desires and forces the sellers, the developers, to adhere to it. Otherwise, they won't buy it. So I think there's a way to do it inside the protocol. TBD if that's effective.
All right, great, thanks. Okay,
Yeah.
let's move on to some of the audience questions. And as always, my apologies if I mangle your names. First question is from Amelia Juliet Demery. When you say we're building this hypergranular model, can you specify who the we is here and what kinds of technical expertise are involved in model design?
Sure. The we is me, Chris Osborne. Um, we just exposed it to Dr. Fei Chai, who is enthusiastically wanting to help support this and help us with it. I'm going to be exposing it to Exois in about a month and getting their input. So we're really building this framework on a process specific level, like all the steps you would have to go through to do ocean fertilization. So it's like almost like a first person simulation of that process, everything from formulation, dispersion, vessel, dispersion technology, where you would do it. And this is specifically for the Gulf of Alaska. And we've got 11 sites configured within that understand the biogeochemical conditions and the surface, subsurface currents and the weather conditions. So it's all on a time scale. Um, then gets into the biologic response range, then into any optimization, then carbon export. So it's a series of layers that have calculations and data libraries attached to them. And it's all meant to be a hypergranular down to the square meter and then expanded how big your site or how big your patches are within a site. You are attempting to fertilize all with data, either engineering specs or scientific data that drive those calculations. And so you create, there's an input scenario form that one would fill out, 2 pages long, and then it goes into the model process engine and it does all the calculations and spits out a report. And so that kind of to the square meter hypergranularity, I think is going to give a lot of insight to how you can do ocean fertilization. And on those scales, they're just super fractional compared to the large Earth system models that try to do everything. So I hope that answered that a little bit.
Okay, great. All right. And question from an anonymous attendee. Can you explain why selling research credits or carbon credits is needed to fund the pilot program? How are concerns about selling credits undermining the credibility and intent of the research program to be addressed?
Yeah, great question. Um, there has been an unwillingness by a lot of funders to fund ocean fertilization research. They're concerned about the controversy dating back to 2012. There's a little bit of fatigue in the discussion of it. They point to, again, oh, there's all these model studies that are showing it'll deoxygenate the world ocean. So, like, again, disambiguating that mess is part of the problem leading to a lack of funding. So, with this new funding mechanism, um, there's the potential to have part, or maybe if they're lucky, all of the cost of the field trial work paid back to the funders. Um, if that becomes an incentive for them to go, okay, we might get half our money back. Maybe this is worth doing. Maybe that changes their incentive structure. The way it separates from any research team that would try this or propose this is that they don't touch the money. Like if I'm the research team and I'm going to go do this and I get a funder to say, yeah, I'll cover the cost and I get some of that money back. It comes from an intermediary. We don't actually touch the money. We don't control it. We don't actually get involved in the sales. We just measure what happens, get that verified with a third party verifier. And you can see all the instrumentation, the calibrations, and everything you would need to know to show, okay, this is what actually made it down to, let's say, 500-meter depth. And so it's just money that would go back to the original funders to help cover the cost as a risk mitigation to the amount of money that would be needed to do this pilot program. The reality is ocean science has been woefully underfunded. I think it's even more underfunded today than it ever has been. And so getting different sources of money might be a way to um, ameliorate that. So I could see there might be some private foundation that says, hey, that sounds like a really good plan. If we get $50 million worth of research out of 4 years, and we get 35 back from that process, yeah, that might change their calculus on it.
All right. Another question about the research credits from an anonymous attendee that I'll tie in here while we're here. It says, how do you differentiate between a quote traditional carbon credit, if it's still in the research phase, and you are a priori predicating the credit on ability to sequester carbon long term and durably? I'm not sure how it's different. I agree we need more money for research, but it seems premature to tie credits to research.
Yeah, I would say today it is premature to tie them to research, which is why we built in 2 years of field trial work before a research credit could be sold by an intermediary to pay for the field trial work. Um, you know, I think there's not an attempt to disguise it as something different. We're calling it a research credit to give it a little bit of a different brand and applying some different rules to it. But at the end of the day, it is a carbon credit. Now, all carbon credits that are being sold today, and probably for the next 100 years, if we happen to have a need for it, they're going to be sold by commercial entities, and they're going to be sold for, there's an amount of profit built into that. So in this case, there's no profit built into it. There's no financial gain. Nobody gets to go home and buy a new car. So it's just to cover a portion of the high cost of field trial work, which doesn't appear to be very many funders coming forward to say, yeah, I'll help fund that. So maybe this changes the incentive by creating this uh, pathway for the money to travel that doesn't include financial gain to any commercial or research entity that might be participating in the field trial work.
Okay. All right. This is a question that may be a little too granular at this point for you to answer, but I'll throw it out there. It's from Rockio Herbert. What MRV will you use?
In the field trial work,
It doesn't specify, but one would presume.
yeah, I think I'll assume that she means it's for the research credit. Um, we would be developing a methodology in the first 2 years. We have some pretty good ideas for how that would go. Um, the science teams that want to do this kind of work have been mapping out what instrumentation and placement and strategy they would want to use. So that's answer part number two. Part number three to my answer is that's a big and complicated component to the modeling work we're doing. Right now, we've got about 5 different strategies for how we would do in a model setting, we would do MRV. And so I don't have a great answer for that. That is one of the more complicated aspects of the reality of ocean fertilization. And it is proving to be a very complicated part of the modeling work that I and Chris Osborne are doing.
Okay. Somebody asked for a link to your report, and I guess the question is, I know you're in draft stage with this. Do you contemplate at some point publishing this either as peer review or through Global Ocean Health? How can people access the your more granular thinking on this?
Yeah, the MCDR governance framework pilot program, there's a paper that we're writing. We're not done with it. Maybe a month from now, we might get to a spot where we can share it. Whether or not we're going to try to get that peer reviewed and published, I don't know. But we will certainly circulate it to anybody that wants to read it when we get a decent enough draft to disambiguate enough of it. It's still a little bit clumsy. Because I'm the lead author.
Yeah.
So yeah,
Okay.
no link to that yet.
Okay. All right. If we'll try to include something ultimately in show notes if we get to that stage, so you can follow up with me,
Yeah,
Anton, too.
I mean, if anybody wants to get a copy now, it's not the final. I'm happy to share it. Like I'll share it with anybody if they want to read it. But my apologies for any clumsiness in it.
Okay. That sounds good. Maybe drop your email address in the Q&A box for folks.
Got
I
it.
think that'd be
Yep.
helpful. Okay. Next question from David Santil. To what extent will carbon sequestration by projects be in practice modeled rather than measured, and related to what extent proposed research credits will be quantified based on models versus actual measurements?
Those are two different questions. Can you read the first one again, just so I
Yeah,
focus on?
it says, to what extent will carbon sequestration by projects in practice be modeled rather than measured?
Oh, I see. I would suspect that's maybe 15 years away. If we can get ocean fertilization studied in the Gulf of Alaska for 4 years and maybe one other location started for that location's process, we're going to know a lot more about it in, let's call it, 10 years. And I think the transition away from really highly acute measurements with instrumentation, which is really expensive equipment and operations, to a more model-based approach. I think that's easily a decade away, but economically it makes sense to kind of go there. But I don't think anybody on the scientific side can safely say that they know enough about this today to have a modeling version of this to just equate. We'll just go do ocean fertilization and make a claim that 8% of that biomass is sequestered. I don't think we're anywhere near that.
Okay. And I guess the second part of it says, related to that, what extent would proposed research credits be quantified based on models versus measurements?
That would be an extra granular answer, and I just don't think that we know enough about that yet. Some locations, it depends on the time of year, it depends on how much you're putting in the water, it depends on subsurface currents, it depends on temperature of the ocean in that location. Like there's so many factors that make it really, really difficult to pin down a number. It would have to be a very, just to be on the safe side, a very reduced percentage. So we're talking single digit, like very, very small. And even then, there would be scientists that would be arguing that that's probably not small enough. So I wouldn't expect that anytime soon.
Okay. Um, Lots of questions about the research credits, so take another one in here. Who are the likely buyers of these research credits after they're verified?
I would be hoping Google would be one. I was hoping Microsoft would be one. We all know that changed. Um, so typical carbon credit buyers that want to support this research, entities, companies that want to support marine CDR in particular would be candidates. Any company or any buyer that really wants good governance would maybe consider being a buyer, because in supporting this pilot program, you'd be supporting probably the highest level of governance development
Hmm.
possible. I think the Gulf of Alaska is the hardest governance nut to crack because, and it should be. It's one of the most important fisheries on the planet, so we cannot get this wrong there. So I think those companies that really want to support this kind of rigor, this kind of work, would be the buyers. And
Right.
I suspect Google might be a good candidate.
Hmm. Um, so presumably, though, it's not going to be any companies that are trying to buy credits to meet net zero commitments or anything like that, right? It's going to have to be good governance folks that are looking to stimulate the industry, right? Which is admittedly a much smaller subset of all potential
Yeah.
buyers in the market, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So I don't know exactly what all their configuration of intentions would be, but I think they would clearly, be motivated by the co-benefits of that location's development of governance in particular, and then research into this MCDR technique as part of that. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Question from an anonymous audience member. Can a government agency come in and shut this down, such as NOAA, given the current administration's view on climate change and science in general, I guess they believe that would be an impetus, or would this sit outside U.S. federal and Alaska governance?
Yeah, I think NOAA being part of the governance framework process would hopefully indicate that they're not just going to show up on a Wednesday and shut the whole thing down. It is for these 4 years mostly research endeavor. Now, if we can sell some research credits to pay for the high cost of it, maybe that brings in the money to do the 4 year pilot program. But NOAA has to be part of, in some way, the governance framework development. Same with the EPA and same with other agencies. So I think the answer is yes. I think they have jurisdiction to do that, even though it would be outside the EEZ. And I think on principle, if this truly isn't wanted by enough of the stakeholders, it's not going to happen. So I think there's multiple ways that they could get this shut down.
Um, that led me to kind of a follow-up question in that context. Given the fact that you contemplate that this would happen outside of our EEZ, how how do you contemplate engaging with external stakeholders outside the United States in a project of this sort?
It's a good question. I don't have a good answer for that. And let me just check in where you're kind of going with this question. Water is always in motion, right? And so if we fertilize a parcel of water, creating a phytoplankton bloom that consumes nutrients and CO2 and sinks, that water parcel will be different. And there are people
Hmm.
that are concerned about nutrient robbing. And so if that
Hmm.
water parcel drifts off and ends up in a biodiversity hotspot with less nutrients than that hotspot needs, if it ends up at a non-transient fisheries location where that water is different, has a negative effect on fisheries, I think we have to be part of the research, has to be cognizant of that and has to be prepared to ultimately do something about that. It could be cessation of all fertilization. It could be a remelioration of that water parcel. I think the study of that water parcel as it travels, as it advects and drifts off in a current, has to be part of the research program. Um, so I think that's a concern. But on the research side for this pilot program, I think that concern, just in terms of scale and potential impact, I think is pretty minimal. Doesn't mean we don't have to be cognizant of it. Doesn't mean we don't have to study it. It just means intuitively, I think just from the size, it's not going to be in the duration. It's not going to be, as I would call the catastrophic crowd would say, it's going to be devastating. It's not.
Okay. All right. So I think we're going to close out there. We're pretty much at the top of the clock, and so once again, I'd like to thank Anton for his interesting presentation and helping to flesh out this proposal. And as always, I'd like to thank our audience for their thoughtful questions. This is obviously grist for a lot more discussion in terms of how we facilitate not only ocean iron fertilization, but other MCDR field experiments and larger scale proposals, right? And I think it's a really critical question for us to be discussing, and it obviously does cut across the axes, as the questions from this audience shows, of science and politics and law and ethics and justice, right? Um, and it's really critical that we do so. So thanks everyone once again. We will return next month with the next episode of the webinar series, and hope you can join us. And in the interim, I hope everyone has a great summer. And with that, I will say goodbye.